keeping the Torah, the Old Testament law, is not the same as loving. All people that love will actually live according to the law, but not all people that keep the law love. It's the same as, think of the logic for a moment. All men are people, but not all people are men, some are women. I may obey the king, but not love him. I probably obey because of law. And if we talk about disobedience, it implies that I am in obedience only through fear. It's not really quite fitting to say I'm in obedience through love. To do a thing out of love is different to doing it out of obedience. So one might keep all of what Christian Church understands to be the commandments, but that doesn't mean you love. In fact, it's more than that. If you love God, you don't necessarily keep the commandments, and probably not in the way that people expect either. Because you have the spirit of the law, which is much purer than the law itself. The law generalizes, and in a sense is much better than no law. Any law is better than no law, just as any, by law I mean general laws. Any government is better than no government. Where there's no government, the chaos is unbearable. But a person who loves knows when it's right to break the law. There are times, for instance, when one is not honest. There are times when you will kill to defend the weak. Some people disagree with this, of course, but there are times when it's probably right to steal. Where great benefit is gained by doing so. And of course where you felt the property was stolen in the first place, or acquired by dishonest means. And of course governments kill and steal all the time. They take against your will in the form of taxation and fines, and they're responsible for much death according to wars they run and so forth. And I think you could argue that, well, it would be impossible for the state to keep the same laws as the individual is required to keep. I'm not sure. Could think that through, couldn't you? I mean, it's tricky. Is taxation going to be voluntary in that case? One of the political arguments was that in some sense citizens enter into an implicit contract with the rest of society to pull their weight and therefore pay tax and therefore fund police, education, defence, administration, perhaps healthcare and so forth. But it's a few faults in that argument. But coming back to it, it's meaningless to command someone to love. It's not a commandment to love God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. It's the way Jesus formulated what the real essence of the law was, and to love your neighbour as yourself, which he thought was like unto it. in the form of Exodus 20, the commandments are not to love God, but to not worship other gods before Him, keep Sabbaths, not to kill, steal, commit adultery, and so forth. And at no point does it talk about love. Even when it comes to parents, it says honour, which I take to mean make sure they're provided for if you can. In other words, you are their pension assurance, ideally in some sense, at least in the culture that we might have been considering in the past. It does say further on, probably in Leviticus, that basically you should love God in the way that Jesus suggests, with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. And I would go further, and that is to say that if you think of the beginning to the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, God reminds them, I think it's in verse 2, that I've rescued you from slavery and from Egypt, brought you out with all these miracles. And you should, as in the Jesus teaching, of course, therefore you would have thought these people would have loved Him. They don't love Him. They're not devoted to Him, to God. And in that sense, the commandments, the principles as I would call them, or sometimes they're called the points, 10 points, I think I'll call them principles, were given in some sense, as I understand it, God was terribly disappointed that they didn't love Him. So yes, they should love Him with all heart, soul, mind and strength, but they don't. And, well, really, to put up with these people, they need to follow at least these precepts, these 10 principles, or you could call them commandments, but I don't think it's quite right. Don't have other gods before me. Don't profane my name. It's not quite the same as saying love me, is it? Keep the Sabbath. If your parents don't kill, steal, commit adultery, covet, or whatever. Okay. So that will in some sense make our relationship with each other bearable. And as my friend points out, well, perhaps that does lead to loving in the end. If it does, Jewish history is not a good example of that. Israel is, of course, a secular state. And it's not clear that religions do embrace love. Though Christian religion does talk about it quite a lot. So they are very similar to what other nations had, neighbouring states and so on. Principles of ethics, really. They're not to love God. They're to make your life bearable if I'm going to have you living in this world of uncertainty. But they're not really about love and devotion to God. Which is why, as far as I know, all Old Testament based religious philosophies and views are essentially in terms of law and obedience. Because there is no love. And there might be a love of the law, because the law makes life a lot easier for people if everybody keeps it. It doesn't in itself embrace loving God. People that love God would more or less keep the law, but less at times. And they felt that it wasn't God's will to keep the law, they would break it. Whereas a legalist, in some sense, is one that simply sticks to the legality and punishes as a penalty where that legality is not met, that requirement. You don't do that with your kids. You don't tell your kids to love you unless you're some sort of Victorian father in England. You don't order your kids to do this, that and the other. You teach them and encourage them to love and be caring and kind, be responsible in that love of those around them. Love of yourself and at the very least the other members of the household, and in fact other members of society and life generally. So that will is within them, not obedience. In other words, quite simply, if you love someone, then their will is within you. If you obey someone, their will is external and imposed upon. And you struggle all the time with obedience, hoping to get round having to be obedient on some issues because your mind and the boss's mind is not quite the same at all. Whereas when you love, you are of one mind. These people had been saved from slavery in Egypt and rescued. They should have loved God as their neighbour, as themselves, quite apart from the fact that God already loved them, chose to love them and care for them. They didn't. Well, you can't imagine what the disappointment would be to God in that circumstance. You will know, of course, that I think the entire thing is a story. The few tiny bits of history that are used are not evidence to me that this detail and story is by any means anything other than a story. Stitched onto, as usual, a few historic facts, so to speak. Which is a very good way of, if you make it into the country's history, historicity I think I should say really, it's believed and taught. Well, the wise know it's teaching the culture, and the unwise think it's history. The wise, therefore, have some flexibility in interpretation and application of the story to living. The unwise tend to be literalists and legalists, which is, in general, well, I'm not sure. In general, it seems to be better than, I hesitate to say in general it's better than no religion at all, because the legalist can so ruthlessly apply his wrong answer regardless of the costs. to others, and even to himself. So I'm not certain that any religion's better than none. I'm almost certain that any government is better than none. But I can imagine some religions that, and know of course, that so ruthlessly treat some people that, and animals, that mankind might be better off with no religion at all, if that were the only option of religion available. But I don't know. Do you know? What do you think? Thank you, Heavenly Father.